Hello, happy Friday. Welcome to PCAP's Prairie's Got the Goods Week. My name is Caitlin Morose, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Edward W. Bork, Professor and Mattheis Chair, Rangeland Ecology and Management, Department of Agricultural, Food, and Nutritional Science from the University of Alberta, will be talking about: does livestock grazing regulate soil carbon in northern temperate grasslands? Check out other events going on for Prairie's Got the Goods Week. Don't miss a presentation by Jessica Brenke, a PhD student from the University of Alberta, about the influence of grazing management on plant community diversity and production across Western Canada. And that's happening today at 3 o'clock p.m. And stay tuned for a presentation about positive contributions of livestock and grazing systems by Rudyard Petre, Executive Director for the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and that'll be taking place April 2nd at 10 a.m. To register for these webinars or to see other upcoming events, please visit the PCAP website, www.pcap-sk.org. I would like to take a moment to note that Prairie's Got the Goods Week is presented by Crescent Point Energy, Wildlife Habitat Canada, and Fast Power, as well as Environment and Climate Change Canada. In-kind support for today's webinar has been given by the University of Alberta. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation, and questions will be answered towards the end of the webinar. I'm really happy to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Edward Bork. He has been at the University of Alberta since 1997, where he is currently the Mattheis Chair in Rangeland Ecology and Management, and also serves as the Director of the Rangeland Research Institute. He has been teaching and conducting research since 1991 on a wide variety of basic and applied topics, such as integrated weed control in pasture grazing systems, fire ecology, forage and legume production dynamics, landscape and disturbance ecology, and more recently on the importance of grasslands in providing environmental goods and services such as carbon storage and the maintenance of biodiversity. Dr. Bork's work has had a primary focus on addressing practical problems of high relevance to practitioners, including livestock producers and managers of private and public rangelands. His work has involved extensive collaboration with other researchers and agencies. He and his graduate students have given numerous extension talks on their work. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Bork.
Oops, don't want to do that. I just want to get rid of this little guy here.
There's a little orange arrow there, and you click that up to hide the control panel.
Perfect. Oops. Can I get rid of this guy yet?
I don't think so, if that orange arrow didn't work, but we can see your screen perfectly. We can't see the dashboard, though. We just see your slide.
Okay, that's great. Okay, thank you, Caitlin. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to PCAP for the invite, and thank you for taking time out on your Friday afternoon to tune in and listen to what I've got to say. Hopefully there'll be some nuggets in here that you can take forward and improve your understanding of how livestock grazing could potentially regulate soil carbon in our northern temperate grasslands. So as Caitlin mentioned, I've been working on this topic for somewhere around close to 10 years now, and it's one that really I consider to be an area of significant importance, in part because we know that obviously CO2 levels are rising. We know there's significant interest in trying to figure out strategies to mitigate climate change, and rising CO2 levels are a part of that, but also because we are very aware that northern grasslands, or grasslands globally, are actually a significant storehouse for carbon, and therefore have significant potential to regulate or offset those rising CO2 levels. And so a lot of our work that we're doing is basically trying to navigate a path forward on that. So just an overview of what I hope to accomplish over the next hour or so. So we'll go over some of the research objectives that we've had, and when I say we, that includes myself, but also a number of other folks, and I'll acknowledge them at the end of the presentation, and talk a little bit about the strategies we've used to try to look at the carbon storage question. I'll give you a quick overview of the study designs and methods, and this is not going to be in a lot of detail, but it'll kind of give you a flavor for the scope of the approaches that we're using, and maybe I'll mention how some of the data sets that we're working with are actually quite novel and quite unique from what other people have done in the past. Because certainly there's been a lot of investigations that have looked at this question of carbon, but some of them have had some significant weaknesses, and I'll discuss some of those. I'm going to break down the results into three different primary questions. The first one is digging into what is the size of the carbon storage pools that we typically see in northern grassland ecosystems, and then dig into this question of what is the specific impact of grazing on those pools, and also discuss some of the linkages to potential plant community properties that we see. For example, plant species composition, and maybe some of the roles of plant diversity, and even what's the contributing factor of, for example, introduced plant species. So those will be some significant themes that will pop out. And then third, I'll talk a little bit about whether litter decomposition and nutrient turnover could be potential mechanistic explanations for interpreting where, when, and how those carbon changes might occur. And I'll finish it off by talking a little bit about some other research projects that are underway that we hope will further refine our understanding of where, when, and how these carbon levels in grasslands change. And so while I don't have data for the last set of studies, I do want to make you aware of them so that you could expect some results in the future from those investigations. So our overall research objectives, and I mentioned these already, but I think it's worthwhile going over them again, is just first and foremost to quantify the size of the carbon stores that we typically see in these northern temperate grasslands. And that includes looking at how much carbon is stored, for example, in the vegetation components, how much is stored in the soil, how much is above ground, for example, in shoot or litter, and that might be in loose litter or litter in various forms of decay at the soil surface, but also below ground in root biomass, and then within the soil also separating inorganic from organic carbon. There's a lot of interest now in looking at the size of inorganic carbon pools, which, as I'll show you shortly, is actually a very sizable component of the carbon stores. And then second, to look at whether grazing increases or decreases carbon, including where and when these changes might be expected to occur, and then identify mechanisms responsible for these carbon changes. And all of these objectives are really aimed towards one particular goal, which is to provide a quantitative or empirical foundation that can be used by policymakers to reward ranchers, and specifically those individuals responsible for managing perennial grasslands, for enhanced carbon storage. That's really our long-term goal. So everything that we're doing is kind of aiming in that direction. So just a brief overview of the study methods. So the very first project that we undertook, and this is the one that I discussed a couple years ago in a fair bit of detail, is our carbon benchmarking study. So it was done between 2012 and 2015, and it sampled 106 grasslands covering 6 natural subregions across Alberta. And you can see the map on the right is basically showing the distribution. We had widespread distribution all the way from the dry mixed grass through the parkland and up into the foothills fescue and even into the upper foothills and montane regions. So we had an enormous gradient of agroclimatic conditions, everything from climate to vegetation composition to soil conditions, very widely across these regions. And you can see some examples here. There's an example of the dry mixed grass exposure, the Schuler exposure, in the lower left, and just above that is the Herald Creek exclosure, which is in the upper foothills within the Rocky Mountain Forest Reserve. So a significant benefit of this particular study, and a unique property, is that we actually had such a large number of grasslands. Many studies in the past have looked at, for example, carbon storage, but very few of them look at this many sites. You know, many of them might look at 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 sites if you're lucky, but to look at 106 sites allowed us to really dig deep into how widespread are these carbon differences. And we also were able to compare grazed and non-grazed areas because we collected data inside and outside each exclosure. So thereby allowing us to draw conclusions about long-term presence versus absence of grazing. And then we sampled vegetation and soil for different carbon components. We looked at shoot herbage, litter, and mulch. And we also looked at the carbon stores in roots. And within the soil itself, we also stratified our carbon into organic and inorganic carbon pools. The strengths, as I mentioned, very large number of study sites, highly variable ecosystems with comprehensive vegetation data that included biomass, but also plant species composition. And that, of course, enabled us to look at specific changes in the identity of plant species or groups of plant species. The limitations is that we only assessed these particular sites down to 30-centimeter mineral depth in the soil. So we don't know how the deeper soil layers, for example, down to 60 centimeters or 80 or deeper. And we also have no test of variable stocking rates. All we could draw conclusions about is what is the long-term presence of grazing doing at typically moderate stocking rates on these publicly grazed grasslands. And so, and I'll talk about some potential differences with some other data sets where we do have an answer to some of the stocking rate issues, for example. So this is the second study. I call it the companion study, and it happens to be a data set from a number of mixed grass prairie sites in Saskatchewan. The sites are distributed across 9 community pastures. There's 33 pastures or paddocks in total. And a unique property in this particular study is that we have access to long-term cattle stocking rates. So we have long-term average stocking rates over a 25-year period, which gives us a much more powerful predictor to look at how, let's say, ecosystem carbon and soil carbon is responding to specific intensities of cattle grazing. So this is a significant improvement over the Alberta data set that I was referring to a moment ago. Another significant difference is that we were able to sample carbon to 60-centimeter depth, and again separate soil organic carbon from inorganic carbon to see how these 2 very different pools of carbon may be responding to different intensities of cattle grazing. And a further benefit of the Saskatchewan data that we had is we also had information on vegetation composition and range health that allowed us to then look at how would changes in composition and associated health potentially impact these soil carbon levels. Okay, a third study that I want to mention and that I'm going to draw some results from is what I call the nutrient cycling study. And this was done between 2014 and 2017, in which we assessed nutrient decomposition or litter decomposition and extracellular enzyme activity in 15 grasslands across 3 different subregions in Alberta. So this is a compromise that we had to make. We couldn't do this at 106 grasslands, so we went down to a subset of 15 of these, and they were stratified within the mixed grass, so a fairly arid region, a parkland region, so roughly mesic, and then a fairly wet environment within the foothills fescue. And a novel component here is we looked at the specific decay rates of 8 different grasses with known differences in response to grazing. So we took litter associated with either plant species that we know decline under increased grazing, species like foothills and plains rough fescue, or needle and thread grass from the mixed grass prairie, or species with a known propensity to increase under grazing. So species like June grass, western wheatgrass, blue grama grass, and then looked at their specific decay rates and how those varied based on whether they were subject to microenvironments associated with grazed or non-grazed conditions. We also looked at one other species, which was the introduced species Kentucky bluegrass. Now you might be wondering, well, why are we doing that? Well, what we're interested in understanding is how changes in plant species composition that we know arise from different stocking rates, for example, may lead to changes in nutrient turnover and specifically carbon breakdown, excuse me, within these grasslands. And the reason we included Kentucky bluegrass is because it's a species that's very well known for being invasive and increasing through many grasslands in Western Canada. It's known to be increasing in regions of the Dakotas, in mixedgrass prairie there. We see it in Alberta throughout much of our parkland and foothills regions, and therefore it could, the invasion and presence of that species could be a significant trigger leading to changes in carbon accumulation. So that's what we're basically trying to test. And the last study I want to briefly mention, and you might not think that this has much relevance, but it's actually an agroforestry study. So this investigation was done between 2012 and 2016, in which we compared a number of agroforestry systems, 3 in particular, at 36 different locations all across central Alberta. Work was led by Scott Chang, Cameron Carlisle, and myself were also involved in that project. And what we did is we looked at comparisons of either shelter belts, so planted trees, naturally occurring hedgerows, or naturally occurring aspen forest, and how the integration with either perennial grassland or annual cropland affect carbon stores and greenhouse gases. And I think there's some fairly important results out of this, and I'm actually going to start with some of these results right up front. So basically the environments that we're talking about here is either a shelter belt cropland, you can see that in the lower left, a hedgerow cropland, which you can see in the middle, or a forest grassland, so a typical silvopastoral pasture. So what's the role of grasslands in storing carbon? Let's start with this overarching question of how much carbon is actually stored within these systems. And as I mentioned, I'm going to start with the agroforestry study. So our silvopastures, where we basically combine perennial forested habitat types together with a perennial grasslands type, actually stored far more carbon in the top 10 centimeters of our mineral soil. And the reason for that is because we're combining 2 perennial vegetation types. So you can see the carbon stores here, the hedgerow and cropland, the shelter belt cropland are storing roughly 80 tons per hectare, but the aspen grassland system, where we have 2 perennial types rather than 1, we're over 100 tons per hectare. So you can see there's roughly a jump of 20 to 25% carbon stores. So the critical thing here is that it's the cropland that's really detracting or taking away carbon storage, because we've converted one of those perennial systems over into an annual cropping system, which is known to release carbon. If we look at greenhouse gas fluxes, we also see a similar benefit to the silvopastoral system. Carbon dioxide fluxes as well as nitrous oxide fluxes were typically lower within the silvopastoral system compared to both the hedgerow and the shelter belt system. And also the methane uptake was actually higher within the silvopastoral system. Now, methane uptake is a good thing. It means we're basically we basically are removing or scrubbing a larger amount of methane from the atmosphere. That is, microbes are doing that service for us in the soil. And overall, if we look at something called the global warming potential, which is looking at the cumulative effect of all 3 of these gases and how they might change the propensity for warming in the atmosphere, we see a lower global warming potential in that silvopastoral system. And again, that benefit goes back to the fact that we don't have croplands within the silvopastoral type. And we see very similar results in our benchmarking study, where we also had a comparison of native grassland compared to adjacent croplands. I didn't mention this in the methods, but we did have a subset of sites where we looked at comparisons between native grassland and cropland. Within the prairie region, we saw a 28% decline in the total carbon pool from around 80 tons per hectare down to about 60 tons per hectare, maybe a little less than that. And in the parkland, we saw an even larger decline of 45%. So going from over 120 tons all the way down to around 75 tons. So that's a marked reduction in the total carbon storage associated with simply a land use conversion. If we take those grasslands and convert them, we put the plow to them, we basically are losing that carbon from the system. Another interesting question is if we look at where the carbon is actually stored within these native grasslands, we found a couple of very interesting patterns, which is that native grasslands obviously contained a very large amount of carbon, but a lot of that carbon was in two pools that were somewhat surprising to us. One of them is what we call the surface mulch layer, which is basically dead and decomposing plant material in various stages of decomposition. The size of the pool of that particular component was well over 10 tons per hectare, and it was most apparent within our more mesic grasslands. So in the foothills fescue, and also in the parkland, that pool tended to be relatively smaller in our more arid mixed grass prairies. And the other pool that we were quite surprised to see being that large, bearing in mind that we're only going down to 30 centimeters within this sampling strategy. That was one of the limitations in our benchmarking study, that the soil inorganic carbon actually represented also well over 10 tons per hectare. And if you look at the adjacent land use types, both cropland and introduced forage, you see obviously the absence of that surface mulch layer. You see a moderate reduction in the size of the soil organic carbon pool, but you also see a marked reduction in the size of the inorganic carbon pool. Not sure why that is, although I have a nagging suspicion that it might be changes in soil pH associated with, for example, fertilization that may have led to the loss of that inorganic carbon, possibly in combination with changes in leaching and hydrology. So question number 2. So what is the specific role of grazing in regulating carbon stores within these northern temperate grasslands? And this is the question that we've really been struggling with and trying to hone in on as to what's going on within these grasslands. In large part because if we're going to develop specific management recommendations for where, when, and how producers should be managing their grasslands so as to maximize carbon, we need to understand the answer to this question. So if we look at all of our carbon benchmarking sites, so this is the larger network of 106 study sites across Alberta, by and large our soil carbon concentrations were greater in the areas exposed to grazing. So you can see that in the graph on the left here. Basically, particularly in the top 15 centimeters of soil, we generally saw a higher soil carbon concentration. And notably, this response appeared to be largely independent of plant biomass. So the graph on the right basically shows if you proportion look at the grass, forb, shallow root, and deep root biomass, you can see that although there's a general trend for the grazed areas to have a higher total plant biomass, we were quite surprised to find out that the difference is actually not statistically significant. The only difference that appeared, at least statistically, was in the forb biomass, which increased by roughly 50%, 55%. Another interesting finding within the same study is that if we looked at the relationship between woody plant cover and the degree of moisture deficit, which is something that we looked at using a metric called the annual heat moisture index. So annual heat moisture index is essentially a measure of aridity. Mixed prairie grasslands typically have an AHM index of somewhere around 40 or higher. So sites on the far right side of this graph are basically the driest sites that we would find in the Medicine Hat region, Brooks region, and so on. Sites that are in the parkland are generally around that 30 to 38. values, so they're kind of in the middle of the graph, whereas our wettest sites are generally on the left side of the graph. They have AHM values typically below 30. And one quick look at this graph, you can see right away that at least in the wetter parts of Alberta, non-grazed grasslands tend to have a higher abundance of woody plant cover. And that goes to reinforcing this notion that grazing is actually an important ecological process responsible for helping minimize the expansion of woody species. So to some degree, we were a little bit worried that this shrub encroachment could possibly explain why non-grazed areas actually tended to have lower carbon. And so we went back and redid the analysis by removing any sites that had more than 10% shrub cover to see what the soil carbon differences were. And indeed, when we pulled all the sites that had more than 10% shrub cover out of the analysis, we no longer had a difference in soil carbon concentration in the remaining 73 sites. And so you can see the difference there. There's still a weak trend for the grazed areas to be greater, but statistically, they're no longer different. We also noticed when we looked at our data set, again across this large network of 106 sites, that our mesic grasslands tended to generally be higher in exotic plant cover. So, and by exotic plant cover, I'm talking about introduced plant species. Some of them are agronomics, like smooth brome, timothy, Kentucky bluegrass would be in that list, white clover, Alside clover, but there could be some other more weedy species as well. Even dandelion would be on that list. The graph on the right again shows that by and large, our grazed communities tended to have anywhere between 10 and up to maybe as much as 15% greater exotic plant cover or introduced plant cover. And again, particularly in our parkland, our foothills fescue, and into the foothills, those wet environments where introduced species generally thrive. And overall, increases in plant diversity were also detected in general due to grazing. And part of that increase was due to this infusion of introduced plant species. And so the graph on the right here is basically showing our natural subregions. And you can see that in the dry mixed prairie, there really isn't a whole lot of difference. This is the mean number of species per community that we sampled. But when you get to the mixed grass, those grazed communities start to show higher species in general. And then the central parkland, foothills fescue, those differences really tend to get magnified. And this is a very common phenomena. If you eliminate grazing out of these grasslands, the diversity tends to decline because you tend to get a smaller group of select plant species that tend to outcompete many of the other species that are found there, where some moderate level of grazing allows for a coexistence of basically grazing tolerant and grazing sensitive species, and you get this melting pot of species, which includes a propensity or abundance of introduced plant species, particularly in those wetter areas of the province. So it's very possible that increases in diversity, including of introduced species, could enhance soil carbon under grazing. And there's an interesting paper that just came out on that in the last few months that indeed points in that direction. If we look at herbage biomass changes, we see that there's generally a positive relationship between herbage biomass and the abundance of introduced species. And so the graph on the right here is basically showing that. What we were a little surprised about is that that relationship was true regardless of whether these areas had been exposed to long-term grazing or not. And in fact, the strength of the relationship tended to be stronger in areas where we didn't have grazing. And it's suggesting that these introduced plant species are actually adding significant production potential. And that may be independent, so uncoupled, so to speak, from whether they're grazed or not. If these introduced species are there, they're actually contributing positively to total biomass productivity. And of course, biomass productivity, so photosynthetic production, carbon fixation is the precursor to putting carbon into the soil. If you don't have fixation, you're not going to have carbon addition to the soil. Now, if we look at soil carbon concentration, so this is, I guess, the most important point, trying to circle all the way back. How did soil carbon change in relation to the proportion of introduced species? Once again, we see this distinct positive relationship between the abundance of introduced species within the community and soil carbon concentrations. And once again, we see that positive relationship regardless of whether these grasslands were grazed or not. So it could well be that the presence of introduced species are actually part of the trigger or mechanism that's leading to this increase in soil carbon, where we see it. So I'm going to switch gears now to the Saskatchewan data and try to draw linkages or expand further on what I just told you about the Alberta results and see how these apply in Saskatchewan. So the data from Saskatchewan, I think, add some opportunities for further clarification. So the data in Saskatchewan were stratified into 3 natural subregions. So we have the dry mixed grass, we have the mixed grass, and we also have the mesic mixed grass. So again, we have this gradient. It's not as marked as the gradient we saw in Alberta. It's a much more subtle gradient, but it still allows us to look at some of these differences regionally. Of importance is that the mesic mixed grass, so this is the wettest of the 3, generally had greater stocking, and that was associated with lower range condition. So the data here is basically showing the absolute stocking rate, and that's in animal unit months per 100 hectares. And you can see that the mesic mixed grass was generally about stocked roughly twice as high as you would find in the dry mixed grass and the mixed grass, but that in turn translated into lower range condition. Now I want to be very clear on the method that was used here to calculate range condition. This is based on the older technique of looking at the nativeness of the plant community. So it involves looking at how representative the existing plant community is of the native climax plant community. So a deviation from 100% means in essence that you have a plant community that's no longer dominated by the same amount of native plant species. And so that's really important here when we start digging down into some of the patterns that we're seeing. We also had the opportunity to look at the inorganic carbon and compare that to the organic carbon profile. So this is the soil inorganic carbon mass in 4 different soil depths. Remember here we're going all the way down to 60 centimeter depth. Again, stratified across these 3 different regions: dry mixed grass, and mesic mixed grass. And what jumps out is a couple of things. First of all, the total inorganic carbon mass down to 60 centimeter depth is large. It varies from roughly 50 tons per hectare all the way up to about 65 tons per hectare. So it's a very large amount of carbon that's stored in the top 60 centimeters of these soils. And the proportion of total carbon, which was pushing 200 tons per hectare in total in the wettest environments, was almost a third, not quite a third. It ranged from 29% all the way up to just about 33% of the total carbon mass. So inorganic carbon is not a trivial component of these grasslands. So this enabled us to look at both organic carbon, which is the one we typically think about since it's regulated by direct plant inputs, but inorganic carbon may be important as well. So most importantly, because we had long-term livestock stocking rates, we were able to relate the stocking rates back to the carbon mass and to see whether carbon mass varied in relation to those stocking rates. Now, we had a bit of a challenge here, and this is an important methodological point that I need to point out. It's obvious that areas of higher rainfall, because they produce more plant biomass, we should expect to see higher carbon levels, because higher plant productivity must lead to greater carbon storage, because we fundamentally have higher carbon inputs into that system. So we needed a way of basically adjusting for differences in precipitation and therefore productivity potential among the regions. And the way we did that is we looked at normalized stocking rates. And so normalized stocking rates basically take the stocking rate and adjust it per unit rainfall, which in this case we use per centimeter of rainfall. And this is a way to try to parse out whether stocking is affecting carbon over and above rainfall. And so this is what you see on the graph in front of you. This is long-term mean stocking rates normalized for precipitation and how carbon mass is changing. And what's of penultimate interest here is that total soil carbon, including soil organic carbon and soil inorganic carbon, all tended to increase with progressive increases in this normalized stocking rate. And so I think this is important because it's suggesting something's going on within these grasslands, including in relation to increasing livestock grazing, that may be increasing our carbon within the soils. And because we had plant species data, we were able to actually look at some relationships between soil carbon and plant community composition. And what we found is that the more heavily grazed grasslands in Saskatchewan, which was basically those in the mesic mixed grass, if you think about that very first graph I showed you relative to the Saskatchewan data, the mesic mixed grass had higher stocking rates, lower range condition, but the reason it had lower range condition is because there's a higher presence of introduced plant species. And so this ordination is basically showing you that. On the right side of the ordination, you see basically convergence between mean annual precipitation, introduced cover, soil organic carbon mass, long-term mean stocking rate, regardless of whether it's normalized or not. And in contrast, you see native cover going in the other direction associated with the dry mixed grass and the mixed grass prairie. So this is adding further evidence that changes in plant species composition that may be associated with these higher stocking rates, excuse me, that may be associated with these higher stocking rates are actually playing a role in triggering some of these changes in soil carbon. Okay, the third question I want to dig down into is what are the biogeochemical mechanisms that might explain grazing impacts on soil carbon, and also look at whether plant species change lead to altered nutrient cycling. So this is the results essentially of our nutrient cycling study. And the first thing we noticed when we looked at the decay rates is that we saw marked differences between whether we were looking at litter decomposition in areas with or without grazing. So the graphs on the right here basically compare the decay curves for non-grazed and grazed grasslands. And what's very apparent is that the grazed grasslands actually tended to have faster decay, leading to smaller or lower litter mass remaining after a period of 18 months. So these litter bags were put in the field and we tracked basically their decay rates over an 18-month period. And you see the largest or fastest decline in the foothills fescue environment in Alberta, which was the most mesic grasslands that we looked at litter decay, and again, specifically within those grazed environments. The other thing that we detected when we looked at differences between the species, so the species comparisons are shown in the lower left. For example, we had much faster decay rates within the introduced plant species Poa pratensis as compared to some of our native grasses. And this particular example included Pascoparum smithii, which is western wheatgrass, foothills rough fescue, Festuca campestris, and June grass, Calarea macrantha. So I think the critical thing to obtain out of this is that if we're grazing and we're changing plant species composition, for example, shifting the community away from native plant species towards some of these introduced plant species that have more rapid litter turnover, more rapid decomposition, it could raise questions as to whether this could be specifically responsible for changes in carbon accumulation within these grasslands, including within the soil component. Now, to know that for certain, we'd have to know what the fate of that carbon is. We'd have to know where that carbon's actually ending up. Is it simply being broken down and being returned back to the atmosphere, or is it finding its way down into the soil? Okay, we also looked at enzyme activity associated with carbon liberation, so carbon turnover. A lot of the carbon in this in plant material is tied up in complex carbohydrates that are that require a microbial breakdown. In order for those microbes to do that, they produce certain enzymes basically to liberate that carbon. And so that's a way of tracking carbon turnover. So this particular graph here is comparing the total carbon liberating enzyme activity and how it ranks between some of these species. And I've specifically highlighted Poa pratensis with the green arrow, so you can see at the 1 month collection time, so this is relatively fresh litter that's been placed in the field. Poa pratensis had a fairly high carbon liberating enzyme activity. And when we looked 18 months later, so after a year and a half in the field, we still see quite high levels of carbon liberating enzyme activity on Poa pratensis. In comparison, there's certain native species, for example, western wheatgrass, that's denoted here with the red line, actually tended to have lower carbon liberating enzyme activity. And indeed, that could explain some of the differences that we see among the species. So, I mean, what this boils down to is that there are trickle-down effects, that when you change species composition under grazing, you're changing the active turnover of nitrogen, phosphorus, and also carbon, which is responsible for ultimately carbon storage. So this is an example of temporal variation in extracellular enzyme activity. Again, I just want to draw your eye to two species here. So this is the various collection times over an 18-month period. This is beta-glucosidase, so this is one of the enzymes responsible for breaking down cellulose and liberating glucose. You can see that Paschopyrum smithii tends to be very low, including at the end of the 18-month period, whereas Poa pratensis tends to be quite high during the middle, early to middle stages of decomposition. Okay, so I'm just going to mention at this point some other studies underway that I think are worthwhile noting, particularly in relation to where we're heading with all of our research in the long term. So I want to mention the Adaptive Multi-Paddock Grazing Study, which is basically looking at how the collective environmental goods and services are changing across ranches in Western Canada using this fairly specialized grazing system. So AMP grazing is basically taking a large area and then subdividing it into many smaller paddocks and then using fairly high stock density, short grazing periods with long recovery periods in order to try to maximize plant growth. So we're looking at a whole host of different plant and soil responses, including greenhouse gases. This is a multidisciplinary, highly collaborative project led by Mark Boyce, and many others are involved in this. And really the goal is to further understand where, whether, and how specific grazing systems may alter soil carbon. We have 30 ranch pairs, so 60 ranches in total, and they're distributed across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And I'll just throw in another advertising pitch for Jessica, who's going to be giving her talk this afternoon. She's one of the graduate students working on this, so you'll get some exposure to what she's finding on the plant end this afternoon. So I'd encourage you to tune into that as well. We also have investigations going on to looking at microbial responses to grazing and linkages to greenhouse gas emissions. So this is specifically trying to delve down into, for example, the diversity of microbes and or how changes in the functional diversity. So for example, those microbes that might be responsible for changes in nitrous oxide emissions or methane uptake, so that we can get a better handle on how grazing specifically impacts greenhouse gases. And again, the goal is to understand how microbial diversity and composition can alter these collective ecosystem goods and services. And that includes forage production, but it's not limited to that. Specifically in the context of this talk I'm giving today, we're interested in soil carbon and greenhouse gas fluxes. And then there's another investigation I just briefly want to mention. Scott Chang has a project that's funded through the Rangeland Research Institute at the University of Alberta, looking at defoliation impacts on carbon flow in grasslands. And this is basically in response to this notion that quite a few folks have been advocating that grazing, particularly these mob grazing formats or systems, high intensity, low frequency grazing, AMP grazing, whatever you want to call it, holistic grazing if you want to call it that, might change carbon flow in grasslands. And I first became aware of this concept when I heard Christine Jones speak from Australia a number of years ago, and I'm sure some of you have heard of that as well. So the objective here is to really understand how different defoliation intensities alter the fate of photosynthetic carbon, specifically looking at where is that carbon going? Are we seeing a greater flow of carbon through, for example, root exudates, and that could be impacting microbes at depth within the soil, and therefore increasing the probability of immobilizing some of that carbon at depth. So this is an attempt to dig into some of those mechanisms, since there tends to be very few studies that actually explore the mechanistic side of that liquid carbon pathway. So just to conclude, so I think it's safe to say that our perennial grasslands, and again, this is a synthesis across the Alberta sites, across the Saskatchewan sites, our perennial grasslands, particularly the non-cultivated areas, contain large amounts of carbon, including within the organic soil and the inorganic carbon, as well as the litter mulch on the surface of the soil. Changes in vegetation composition, perhaps even independent of grazing, appear to regulate biomass and therefore soil carbon. And more specifically, the abundance of introduced species, together with overall plant diversity, together with greater cattle stocking rates, may actually be responsible for working together to increase soil carbon, in part due to altered nutrient cycling rates. So I just want to thank some of my colleagues. This is not a solitary effort by any means. I've had lots of folks that I've been collaborating with over the years: Cameron Carlisle, Scott Chang, Mark Boyce, who's leading the AGGP project, AMP grazing, Daniel Hewins, Lisa Ratz, Karen Thompson. We've had a small army of graduate students. I drew quite heavily on the results of Mark Lysing, Sean Chuan, and Mark Akamfor, so I just want to pay special thanks to them, and a small army of summer students and lab assistants as well. So thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. I would just like to mention to our listeners out there that Sean Chuan did a presentation for us about a month ago, and you can find that on the PCAP YouTube channel, and that's www.youtube.com/user/skpcap, as well as other presentations that went on throughout the week for Prairie's Got the Goods Week. Dr. Bork, we do have a couple questions for you, so thank you again for this awesome presentation, and to all of our listeners, feel free to type in any questions that you have. There's a listener named Dave that would like to know, how does natural grassland carbon storage rates compare with croplands, summer followed versus zero-till versus continuous cropping?
Okay, so, and Caitlin, I assume they still have access to my slides, is that right?
Yes, that's right. So feel free to flip through and show any graphs that you'd like to.
Yeah. So I flipped quickly back to the slide basically that shows the comparison of the total carbon stocks in our native grassland as compared to the cropland. So you can see the difference. You know, we're looking at roughly 35 to 40% less overall carbon mass within our cropland as compared to our native grassland systems. Now, a big part of that is the loss of the surface mulch in combination with a marked reduction in the inorganic carbon, and I talked a little bit about what the potential mechanisms might be there. Could have to do with changes in hydrology, it could have to do with changes in soil chemistry and the release of that carbon if we have a reduction in pH associated with fertilization and so on. And this reduction, let's say of 40%, is pretty consistent with what you find globally. So if you look across, studies worldwide that show if you take a perennial grassland and you convert it, you lose anywhere between 40 and 55%, and some estimates are as high as 60%. And that's because you're adding oxygen, you're warming the soil, and that creates a microenvironment that's more favorable for the microbes to basically break that down. Now, the second part of Dave's question, I believe, was relative to conservation cropping. Now, the thing I want to point out here is that, for example, in Alberta, we have a well-established system in place for producers that are growing annual crops to be rewarded, for example, for using conservation practices. So if you're practicing minimum till or zero till, you're eligible for a carbon payment of, let's say, somewhere around $1 an acre, give or take, a year. And the rationale behind that is because if you look at the graph that I'm showing you here, we're basically paying producers to try to increase the size of that organic carbon pool to get it closer to what it was historically. The ironic thing, though, is that the damage has already been done. So we're trying to incentivize producers to move it back closer to where it was, yet the native perennial grassland actually stored the largest amount of carbon to begin with, and yet we're not recognizing that. And so, and this is a fundamental challenge that we have in the policy arena, that we're unwilling to acknowledge and value carbon that's currently stored and protected at a very high level within these perennial grasslands. And there's a kind of perverse irony here that we're willing to pay crop producers for practicing minimum till and taking it closer back to what it was, but we're not willing to value the carbon that's currently stored. So worded another way, if I'm a producer and I have a perennial native grassland in Alberta, I'm not eligible for carbon payments. But if I plow it under and liberate 40% of the carbon and I start direct seeding, I'm eligible for a carbon payment, which doesn't make any sense.
Wow, that's I don't even know what to say to that.
Well,
huh. I guess we'll move on to the next question. That's a really nice way that you put it, or a really direct way, an accurate way that you put everything. So thank you. So our next question is again from Dave. How does increased CH4 release from increased cattle stocks balance with the increased soil carbon storage with increased grazing? That is a very, very good question. I'm just going to flip back to this graph on the CH4. So now I think Dave's question is going right to the heart of this. You know, I have an old saying that I like to use, is that figures can lie and liars can figure. So if you're trying to assess the impact, for example, of the cattle industry on greenhouse gases, you know, enteric methane production from cattle, from beef cattle, is often blamed as being a significant source of greenhouse gases. The flip side, and that's true, that sure, enteric methane production occurs, and it's a part of the, you know, it's a part of the byproduct of that particular economic activity. But I would say two things to that. First of all, if that's all you present, then we are greatly misleading the public, and we're misleading the public for two ways. The first one is that a healthy grassland actually serves as a methane sink. Okay, and this graph shows that, for example, that the silvopastoral system actually had higher uptake of methane relative to the hedgerow and shelter belt system, keeping in mind that the hedgerow and the shelter belt had that annual crop component as part of its system. And the reason for that, and there's been other studies that have shown this. There was a study out of Saskatchewan not too long ago that showed that these perennial grasslands actually can be a very important sink of methane. So if you have cattle grazing going on a perennial grassland, to do a full methane accounting, you need to then factor in what is the methane uptake by the soil and combine that with the enteric methane to truly look at the overall footprint. Okay, and I'm not going to, you know, I'm not going to go through that. That's going to depend on the level of those. But what I would tell you is that there are studies suggest that those two things are close to canceling out. Okay, they might be positive in some cases, negative in other cases. So I think it's important to kind of
factor in the big picture thinking, especially on the methane end. The other thing I would point out is the irony here is that these grasslands pre-European settlement were all used to being grazed. They were being grazed by bison. They were being grazed by elk. I mean, the estimates of bison in North America were upwards of 60 million plus. So to argue that we shouldn't be grazing ruminants on these grasslands is nonsense, because bison would have been grazing on those same coarse roughages and they would have been producing methane. So I think it's a red herring to argue that we should stop, for example, cattle grazing because we don't want to liberate carbon through methane through enteric methane production. That's silly, and that's why it's really important to take the big picture context here. These grasslands were used to being grazed, they're adapted to being grazed, and yes, grazing cattle on them, just like grazing bison on them, would have produced methane, but the soils can also serve as a sink for methane, and we need to do a full accounting and looking at how those things cancel each other out.
Fabulous answer. Thank you. You can probably hear me in the background. I'm taking notes like mad and writing all this down. You just have a very eloquent way of saying, I guess, what a lot of us want to hear. So thank you for that answer. There's a question from a listener named Tara. I guess just to what you were saying there, is there any difference between cattle and bison methane production, or ways that they graze and do foliage and impact carbon sequestration?
Well, I wish I knew the specific answer to that. To my knowledge, nobody has looked at that very, very specific question. We have done work here in Alberta looking at historical ungulate gills, including, for example, bison and elk and deer, as opposed to cattle. But we've looked at it from the perspective of habitat use, impacts on the plant communities. I've published a paper looking at aspen, for example, impacts on aspen. But we've never, to my knowledge, nobody's actually looked at the impacts or the comparison of contemporary cattle grazing with bison on things like methane production, at least, and certainly not carbon storage within grasslands. I suspect, and again, I have not looked into that in detail. I have not. I suspect maybe someone has done some very controlled studies around that. I suppose it's possible. And again, if what was it, Tara, that had asked the question? I mean, if Tara shoots me an email note, I can take a quick look in the literature and get back to her on whether I find anything. It's an intriguing question. What we do know is that bison and cattle are functionally quite similar. They prefer similar habitats. They have similar feeding strategies. They're both bulk feeders. They, by far and away, the majority of their diet, 85–90% plus, is herbaceous material. So I would expect that they're probably not huge differences, but there could be small ones. It's possible, because they're not identical in terms of their physiology in the end.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I guess this kind of tells us we need to do more research on this topic. And yeah, thank you for that answer. We have a question from a listener named Jerry. Any comments relative to the results of increased carbon with introduced species in native grassland relative to range health, ecological goods and service, and climate change?
Well, yes, I have lots on that. So I guess the one cautionary note that I would point out is that we're very, very quick at times to condemn introduced species as being necessarily bad and detrimental to the system. And I think as a society, we're shifting more and more to looking at the functional ecology of these ecosystems, and that includes grasslands, and trying to look at it through an unbiased perspective so that we don't immediately penalize introduced species, for example. And there may still be very good reasons to consider certain introduced species as undesirable. You know, if they're unpalatable, for example, if they're highly invasive and known to spread out of certain ecosystems, if they do not contribute, for example, to productivity, carbon storage, biomass, high quality forage, But I mean, bluegrass is one of those that's very interesting, because there are folks in Western Canada that consider it to be a naturalized species, and I would be among those. We're simply not going to get rid of it. But also there's others that even feel that there may have been a native Kentucky bluegrass or a derivative of it, and it's such a homogenized melting pot of bluegrass out there now. So do we take a stand and say that bluegrass is not a good species? I'm very reticent to do that, because we know it's very good at producing biomass, high quality feed. Its rhizomatous nature makes it a very good soil stabilizer. So there's many reasons that we might want to see bluegrass within these systems. Does that mean we want to see only bluegrass? No, probably not. That's probably not the case. So all I would say is I think we need to be careful in how we pigeonhole and bias introduce species to automatically being undesirable. We have to do these, each species has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, but I think there is compelling evidence here that the agronomics, the introduced species, are actually adding productivity to our grasslands. And in some cases, it's maybe combined with plant diversity increases, but maybe due to grazing itself, maybe improving certain ecological goods and services, and that includes productivity, but it also includes carbon storage. I just want to point out, I kind of skipped over that fairly quickly, but when we did our Saskatchewan study, I did come across a paper by Sanderson, and Sanderson is a group down in the Dakotas, and they've been very active looking at greenhouse gas fluxes and carbon storage and mixed grass prairie systems. And they actually published a paper not too long ago where they tested the hypothesis of whether bluegrass encroached areas changed soil carbon. And their hypothesis is that the bluegrass encroached areas would be lower. They actually found the opposite. They found that the bluegrass encroached areas were higher in carbon, which is exactly the same pattern that we're seeing in Saskatchewan. So I think the evidence is starting to stack up that even though we may not like to see bluegrass that abundant, it may be contributing more benefits than we think. And again, I'm not saying that we need to have bluegrass everywhere. That's not my position. But I think we need to better understand what is driving these increases in carbon.
Thank you for that answer. A listener named Nick has commented that he understands that once native prairie has been broken, you can never really have a true restoration because it took, thousands of years for native prairie to form. However, he would like to know, have there been any studies done on how reseeded or restored native prairie that's been seeded back to a native grass mix compare for carbon storage to true native prairie? And he thinks this could be helpful in helping producers choose which type of grass species to seed going forward.
So there actually have been studies that have come out of the Lethbridge Research Station. So Dr. Walter Wilms, who's now retired, and John Dormar. John Dormar was a well-known soil scientist who did a lot of work at Stavely and also at the 1-4 Research Station. So they did look at abandoned cropland that actually recovered and came back into native mixed grass prairie. And so these papers are out there. I think the key findings from that are basically that soil carbon actually changes fairly quickly. So there have been upstream studies and downstream studies. And what I mean by that, there are studies that have taken prairie, cultivated it, and then looked at how quickly the carbon changes. So Whalen and all published a couple of papers on that, basically tracking how quickly the carbon goes out. And then there's these other studies that have looked at, well, if you take cropland back in the 40s and 50s and you idle it and you allow it to naturally revegetate, does it come back? The answer is it does come back. It at least in the mixed prairie, it does. In the foothills, it's a different story because it's a wet environment and there's such a weed pressure that often the rehabilitation or revegetation of those areas is very problematic. I would agree with the comments that were made. in the case of the 1,4 studies where they looked at recovery, it was very striking that even after 40, I believe it was 40 or maybe close to 50 years, that the organic matter levels had not recovered within the areas that had returned back to native prairie. So I think the take-home message from this is that once we take a native grassland and you cultivate it, you lose the ecosystem service of carbon storage fairly quickly. But to put that carbon back takes a much longer period of time. So we need to be aware of that from a risk management perspective. It's, you know, the penalty is incurred quickly, but to try to rehabilitate it is a very long-term proposition. And, you know, I would hazard a guess that it probably will recover, but it may take hundreds of years because it's a slow accumulation of carbon over time to try to get it back to that old equilibrium that it was once at.
Thank you for that answer. A listener named Jennifer says, if I understand correctly, as a producer, are you recommending that I should preserve natural grasslands as well as increase biodiversity in other areas where there are no longer natural grasslands?
The answer to the first question is absolutely yes. So if you're a producer and you have native grasslands, now, so here's the caveat I would put on that. From a ecosystem good and service perspective, there's no doubt that the native grassland is going to store more carbon than any other alternate land use. Okay, the challenge is I'm also practical enough to know that producers need to be able to pay their bills, and they need to have a economically sustainable operation. So the reason we're doing all this work is because we're downright annoyed that there are no mechanisms for producers to get compensated for the ecosystem goods and services that they're providing, namely the carbon storage. So Jen is going to be making her decisions based on what, you know, the sources of revenue that she can make from that system, which up until now is basically based on how much forage is produced and what's the quality of that forage and how does it translate into weight gain. So until we recognize and potentially incentivize through economic means a way to compensate producers for all of these other ecosystem goods and services, that includes carbon storage, I'd say it goes to biodiversity, and it should also include wildlife habitat, particularly consumptive wildlife. But I don't even want to go there because that's a whole nother can of worms. But all of those are other really valuable ecosystem goods and services that producers should be recognized for and ideally rewarded for in monetary terms. And that would then change the decision of every producer in terms of how likely are they to retain and maintain and maybe improve, including adding more diversity to these perennial systems.
It's a really powerful answer. Thank you for that. Just to touch a little bit on the wildlife side of things, does biodiversity improve the whole system of carbon storage? Is there a connection there?
So the jury's out on that a little bit. In general, yes, we tend to see higher carbon storage in areas of higher diversity, but that also is closely correlated with the moisture regime as well, because, for example, in Alberta, the dry mixed grass prairie tends to have lower diversity as compared to the foothills fescue. So, but that is also represents a shift in moisture regime. So, and that's one of the challenges that we have in trying to separate out carbon storage from, let's say, grazing effects, because we know there's this chronic background influence of climate. Climate is the dominant factor that affects everything from plant growth, biomass productivity, and therefore carbon fixation, right? So we need a way to kind of adjust for those regional level effects. And we did that in the Saskatchewan data by using that normalized stocking rate, where we looked at stocking rate relative to each centimeter of rainfall. So My quick answer to that is yes, we generally see that, but it's also correlated with a change in rainfall, so we need to be careful there. So, but that's another area that we will be digging into in a lot more detail as well.
Okay, thank you. Along that same line, do you have any information about like plant species and soil carbon? One of our listeners has commented here that she used to hear that invasive crested wheatgrass correlated with declines in soil carbon.
So that is correct in that the areas that have been, and I'm going to couch this carefully because, so again, lots of data are showing this. There's data from southern Saskatchewan, and there's lots of data that John Dormar and Walter Wilms have compiled from primarily the 1-4 research station, where they have compared, for example, Russian wild rye with crested wheatgrass with native prairie. And it clearly shows that the highest soil organic matter and carbon levels are associated with the native prairie. The one wrinkle here is, again, linking back to the previous question, that's generally associated with a wholesale shift in the, or replacement of the mixed prairie community with these agronomic stands. So if you have an agronomic monoculture of crested wheatgrass, yes, it's lower in terms of soil organic matter as compared to the mixed prairie. But so how much of this is driven by the fact that we at one time cultivated it? How much of it is driven by the fact that we have a monoculture and not a plant diversity anymore, not a polyculture, a mix of species? And so we need to be careful in trying to tease that apart. So in general, I would agree. We know this for certain high-profile species like Russian wild rye, crested wheatgrass. The work we're doing on Kentucky bluegrass, we're parsing that out of more complex plant community data. So we're not specifically looking at, if you have a monoculture of bluegrass, this is the carbon you get. We're pulling patterns out of the existing plant communities, looking at, hey, there's an association between the abundance of bluegrass and soil carbon. Okay, there's a big difference there.
Yes. She'd also like to know, would adding litter mass improve carbon storage?
So in theory, yes, adding litter, but the caveat is, where does that litter end up? So if you're simply adding litter to the system and it's being broken down fairly quickly and it's not being incorporated in the soil, then I would say not necessarily. So it depends on the type of litter, the amount of litter, and ultimately where it ends up. But in theory, yes, if you're adding litter, litter contains carbon, so in theory, absolutely yes. Maybe a footnote to that. One of the significant challenges we've had in the AMP grazing project is that when we were selecting ranches and places to investigate the effects of AMP grazing on soil carbon, we had to be very careful to make sure we didn't confound, for example, bale grazing on pasture with the grazing system itself. So a grazing system is basically the timing and frequency and intensity of grazing and the length of rest periods, the length of the grazing periods, and so on. But if we have a additional management factor going on, such as a lot of supplemental feeding, including over winter, that represents a massive infusion of carbon into the system. So, I mean, I can tell you that if you go in and you apply large amounts of manure, or you apply large amounts of hay, or large amounts of waste material, whatever it is, onto any system, you're going to add organic matter and you're going to add carbon. So in our work, we've been very deliberate in trying to parse out the effects of the grazing system itself, as opposed to bale grazing or the infusion of any kind of material. So in theory, yes, adding litter adds carbon, but I want to be careful because, first of all, we have to know what kind of litter, how much, and where is that litter going. If you add enough of it, I would think it would probably increase carbon. I'd also point out that that represents an energy input. Right? Litter's not free if you're adding litter. Now, if you're building up litter within the system, so you're building it up on site, then that represents an important carbon reservoir. So, you know, if the context of the question, should I be building up more litter? The answer is yes, because it has all kinds of other benefits, such as maintaining more soil water, reducing evaporation, and therefore you'll get positive feedback through increases in plant growth. But that's very different than adding litter. So I've answered the question kind of two ways. Do you want to have more litter? You absolutely do. Do you want to add litter from outside sources? Well, that comes at a cost as well.
Thanks for that answer. It looks like we have one question left here, if that's okay. A listener named May comments that, or she asked, grasslands versus forest, which is better at carbon storage? And does it depend on how deep you look for the carbon? And she notes that carbon sequestration studies of either of them never seem to have comparable depths or pools studied.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. So on average, forests actually store a much higher proportion of their carbon above ground. So you know, if you look at the relative biomass allocation, far more of that carbon is stored above ground. Now, that has certain benefits because it means that we can take that carbon, we can take trees, for example, we can harvest them, and we can take the timber and we can sequester it in houses or you know, other structures that we're building. And that's a form of carbon storage, believe it or not, and it's quite a large one if you look globally. The problem is, in terms of the carbon storage within forests, because it's above ground, it's also very susceptible to short-term catastrophic disturbances such as fire. So a fire can come through and liberate massive amounts of carbon from the system. And yes, there's a significant amount of carbon in the roots of forests, but here's the difference. Grasslands have a much smaller amount of their carbon above ground. They have a larger proportion of their carbon below ground. For example, in the mixed prairie, about 85% of the live biomass is below ground, including the carbon. However, that's not the big carbon reservoir in grasslands. The big carbon reservoir is actually in the organic carbon that builds up over time. And so you don't typically see that high humic layer, that well-developed humification layer within forests. So a lot of my forestry colleagues are very surprised when I tell them that our grasslands contain anywhere between 80 and 200 tons of carbon per hectare, and they're quite shocked. And they readily admit that their forests do not contain that much carbon. And it's not because of the carbon that's in the vegetation, it's the carbon that's stored in the organic matter. And that's why grasslands are such an important piece of the global carbon picture.
Wow, sorry, I'm writing these notes down here. That's really powerful stuff that you're saying about grasslands being an important part of the carbon picture. So that's all the questions that we have today. Thank you so much for the awesome presentation. Thank you for all of your work that you're doing in this field. We really appreciate it. To all of our listeners out there, thank you so much for tuning in. This webinar has been recorded, so you're welcome to catch it on the PCAP YouTube channel in the near future. It should be up later today or tomorrow. So with that, thank you everyone, and have a great rest of your day, and have a great weekend. Bye.